Oh, welcome, everybody. I'm Bill McCarran. I'm the director of the Press Freedom Center at the National Press Club. This is one of 8 events that are happening across the next few days about press freedom. And we're very happy that our panel can be here and that all of you can be here to listen to them. I want to thank our sponsors for this event and other events. They include the Washington Post, the Foley Family Foundation, the National Press Club, the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and we're happy for that and welcome all of that support. You're going to kick off topic and thing? Okay. So thank you all for being here. Our panels are usually discussing the problems of journalists overseas or in other countries or authoritarian countries. Today's panel is different. It's about U.S. challenges and the growing problems that we are facing. So, Mike Balsamo.
Thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Balsamo. I'm the president of the National Press Club and the National Law Enforcement Editor at the Associated Press. Thank you all for being here because this is, without question, one of the most urgent conversations we can be having now. We talk often about threats to press freedom abroad, and we should, but we can't lose sight of what's happening here at home. In the United States, journalists face a rising tide of pressure: legal intimidation, physical threats, coordinated harassment, shrinking access, and government efforts, subtle or not, to control the narrative and sideline scrutiny. These aren't distant or abstract concerns. They're happening now, and they're happening more often. At the Press Freedom Center here at the National Press Club, we're tracking these threats. We're responding with emergency support, legal guidance, and advocacy, and we're sounding the alarm, not just when a journalist is jailed overseas, but when a reporter here in the U.S. is denied entry, sued into silence, or harassed into stepping back. We know this work can't be done in isolation. It takes all of us across newsrooms, platforms, and generations to hold the line. Today's panel brings together 4 people who've been at the center of this fight, from confronting government overreach to advocating for jailed journalists abroad, to training newsrooms on safety and experiencing firsthand the trauma and pressure of covering democracy under attack. This will be a moderated conversation, so while we won't be opening the floor to questions, I hope you'll use today, what you hear today as fuel to sharpen your thinking, to strengthen your newsrooms, or to simply remind yourself that you're not in this fight alone. And if you want to do more, if you want to help defend the rights to report freely and safely, we hope you'll connect with us after this discussion. The Press Freedom Center exists to protect journalism, but more than that, it exists to protect the public's right to know. Let me introduce our panelists. Anna Johnson is the Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press, where she oversees coverage of U.S. elections, politics, and the federal government, including foreign and domestic policy. Before coming to Washington, she served as AP's news director for Europe and Africa, based in London, and previously held editing and reporting roles in Phoenix, Chicago, and Cairo. She brings a deep global perspective to her leadership at a time when independent, fact-based journalism faces growing pressure here at home. Tom Durkin is the Director of Safety Education at the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation and a longtime friend of journalist James Foley. He also serves as a research and grant coordinator at Marquette University's Center for Peacemaking and is a lecturer in English and Peace Studies. At the foundation, Tom leads efforts to equip journalists with the training and tools they need to navigate their physical, digital, and psychological risks of this profession, helping to build a safer future for the next generation of reporters. Kate Woodsome is a former Washington Post journalist who spent the last 2 decades reporting and leading global news teams through political unrest and public health crises and social change, from Cambodia to Cuba to Washington, D.C. At the Post, she helped cover the January 6th attack on the Capitol, an experience that became both a professional turning point and a personal reckoning with trauma and burnout. She now leads Invisible Threads, a media and education lab focused on strengthening the nervous system of democracy, and works as a scholar and senior fellow developing trauma-informed frameworks for healing and social change. And Paul Beckett is the former assistant editor and Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, where he oversaw coverage of politics, national security, the Supreme Court, and the intersection of business and government. He previously served as Asia editor, South Asia editor in New Delhi, and led Wall Street Journal bureaus in both London and Mexico City. Paul also played a central role in the journal's efforts to secure the release of Evan Gershkovich from Russia and has been a vocal advocate for stronger newsroom solidarity in defense of journalists worldwide. So let's start with something unfolding right now that strikes at the core of press freedom in this country. Anna, the Associated Press, has filed a lawsuit against the White House over restrictions that have blocked wire reporters from key events, including Oval Office sprays and Air Force One. Can you give us an update on where that legal effort stands and why this issue matters, not just for news organizations, but for the public's right to independent, real-time coverage of the presidency?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Mike. So I'll start just where the lawsuit stands. It's still ongoing. We are still waiting on actually a ruling in the appeals court. But it has prompted, as I'm sure some of you or many of you are probably aware, some changes at the White House to the press pool makeup. This started back in February when the Associated Press, which has long and always covered the White House, was barred from covering in-person events at the White House, many of them. Often it's talked about the Oval Office and Air Force One, but it goes well beyond that. Because of a style book. The AP has a style book that is used by the AP in newsrooms and others around the globe. We are a global news organization, and that style book reflects that our decisions on sort of, it goes from everything from grammar to choices on word choices and names to reflect that global audience that we have. And we, after the president decided to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, we updated our style book and said that the Gulf of Mexico was what it's been called for 400 years and is well known, and that is the name well known globally, and that was the name that we would be using, but also reflecting that the change that President Trump had made and that would sometimes be used as well. The White House and the president did not like this, and that was the result of they barred us from covering. This is obviously well beyond just sort of this case that we have. We ended up filing a lawsuit after exhausting every possible avenue to try to resolve this, but it became quite clear that it was really that was our only option was to do that. And it is not obviously about the name in the style book. This is about freedom of speech and about government, the United States governments should not retaliate against journalists or anyone in this country for the language that they use. And we filed this lawsuit, is still ongoing. We had a ruling from a judge here in Washington, a federal judge, Judge McFadden, I know several weeks ago, for a preliminary injunction to require the White House to readmit us back into this coverage. The White House there's been some changes, but one of the decisions that the White House did was that, and we're deeply disappointed in this, is that instead of readmitting the AP to the full press pool, they barred all wire. Well, they got rid of this permanent thing involving all of the wires. So that's us, Bloomberg, and Reuters from being, we always, for a long time, been where the president was, traveled with the president. And we did that not because of the AP. We did this, all of us, the wires are independent, nonpartisan, fact-based news organizations whose job is to cover the White House and many things around the world, not just, for people around the world. The AP has, our audiences are far and wide. They span the political spectrum in this country and all around the world, and our customers are the same. They rely on us because they can't be here to cover the White House. They rely on us for that. And so, as a result, the wires no longer are guaranteed to be able to cover the president, and we are incredibly disappointed on that as our lawsuit continues. And we really feel that this is not, obviously just about the AP. It is about all journalists, but more importantly, it's bigger than that. It's about all people in this country about their freedom of speech and about, really. We feel that we had to stand up for this, and it was just so crucial. It's our mission, and it's crucial that, in this country, in the United States, it's fundamental to democracy that the government not retaliate against you for the words that you choose, the language that you choose.
So, and I want to follow up there. Obviously, access to key events and officials has always shaped what the public sees, but we've seen this access being limited in new and concerning ways. as you just described, the elimination of the wire pool, for example. How are you approaching political coverage and, leading politics in Washington when access to the White House or to the president is withheld, not just as a logistical challenge, but as a matter of public transparency?
It's a great question, Mike. I mean, well, this has been a challenge for us, and the ways that we cover and our journalists cover the White House. Fundamentally, though, our mission is not changed at all. We're here to do fact-based, nonpartisan journalism and coverage of the presidency and coverage of his administration, coverage of Congress, coverage of the courts. And so while there are challenges, and it is created logistical challenges, you noted there have been challenges where, we have not been able to be in the room and ask questions on behalf of the American people, on behalf of all of our customers. We, though, have approached the journalism, in the same way that we always would, that we have with every president, no matter who their party, no matter who is in office. And I think that is that is so crucial here that, our team goes to work every day, and their job is to report on the stories and to report the journalism and to do their jobs. And we continue to do that, no matter the challenges that we face, even though it has been, presented, has been tricky and complicated at times, more from a logistical standpoint, and us trying to do that. But we're committed. I'd say, the biggest challenge, of course, logistically was in photos. If you're not in the room, it's really hard. But we have, our team has done phenomenal work in finding other ways, getting around the outsides, being able to still do their jobs, which is the most important thing.
So I want to zoom out for a second, and Paul, you have a lot of experience both in the U.S. and overseas. So we often talk about press freedom threats abroad, but as Anna has just been detailing, here at home things are changing too, subtly but also more systemically. What do you think feels different about the press freedom environment in the U.S. right now than, say, it did 5 or 10 years ago?
I think the big question for me, Mike, is will the U.S. media industry respond in a way that we saw it respond to crises that are happening overseas that are very clear-cut and very much a question of it is obviously bad. That's something that we can all champion and, to be honest, could champion at relatively little cost to us. So at the Journal, we were incredibly gratified, a little surprised, and deeply touched by the fact that we never, I don't think in the 16 months that we were campaigning for Evan's release, ever had a news organization turn us down flat and say, we're not interested, or this is conflicting for us, or this would make our lives tricky, so we're not going to help you out. Right? And it was a tremendous response. We've all been in the media for a long time. It was a question, and that question, the resounding answer to that question was positive and heartening and ultimately incredibly effective, because the reason that one of the big reasons that Evan and Alsu and Vladimir and Paul and 12 other people came out of Russia on August 1st last year was the united front that the US media, helped by the international media, the spotlight that they shone on their cases. And the purpose wasn't really to put pressure on the Kremlin because we didn't think that they would care. We knew they wouldn't care. The purpose was to put pressure on the White House and allies to get a deal done, to get them released. The question I have now for a domestic situation is, was that a unicorn situation that was so clear-cut and so reprehensible in how it had been conducted that it brought the media together? Is that a one-off? Or when you look at the sorts of actions that Anna was talking about, with the way the White House has been restricting access, the way the White House has taken control of distribution of the pool reports, the way that the White House is very clearly choosing outlets when it comes to the news it wants people to see, is that a level of interference, or is that a significant enough threat that the US media industry will band together? Or will it fragment and say, I'm really sorry it happened to you, but we can't afford to do that? We can't afford to not be there, so I'm sorry, we'll help you out, but tough. And essentially, I just hope it doesn't happen to us. I think the record that you have seen in other areas that the Trump administration has challenged, like law firms, like universities, like other institutions, those who conceded will continue to concede. Those who stood up and said no will be challenged, but they know that they're doing the right thing. And the question will be, what is then the response? But they've made their position clear, and they made the position clear, and the administration can take their action based on that. So every journalistic institution that covers the White House says, am I in that camp, or am I in this camp? And we don't know the answer.
I want to come back to some of your work on Evan's case in just a minute, but maybe we can lay the landscape of journalist safety and where it stands right now. So Tom, when we talk about journalist safety, we're no longer just talking about hostile environments abroad. Can you talk about the kinds of threats you're seeing here in the US and how they're changing the ways that reporters are doing their job and the way that you're doing your job in training the next generation of journalists?
Yes, and Nate, first I want to just thank you for having me on this panel. I'm really honored to be here. There are a number of ways that we're working with student journalists, and this becomes really interesting from my perspective in the sense that it's nice to call them student journalists, but you're either a journalist or you're not a journalist. Being a student doesn't protect you. And we do see college newsrooms across the country breaking huge stories, whether it's at Northwestern talking about hazing in the sports programs, if you're at University of Florida talking about how the former president spent funding, if you're talking about University of North Carolina, they win a 4-year battle to get campus sexual assault records. I mean, these are working journalists. So it's interesting to think about, we're trying to work with students to become effective journalists. And in the learning process, they have to recognize that safety, it's not an add-on. It's a key part of being a journalist. So what we're finding is that we have to work with universities to recognize that the process of becoming a journalist includes safety. Years ago, Diane Foley and I would visit schools, and we were primarily focused on overseas reporting, conflict journalists, people like Jim, who are freelancers. And we had some schools at that point, 5-10 years ago, that we would talk about, what are you doing for safety? And they would say, well, we don't deal with safety. We're trying to train journalists. And we don't get that pushback as much anymore. They recognize that student journalists are, for a lot of communities, they are the local news. And they're working within institutions. Like, so if they're talking about a professor who maybe has allegations against them, they're gonna get pushback. So what we're seeing is that we have to do a better job to prepare our journalists for what they can expect. They shouldn't graduate, then find out, oh, there are all these safety issues. Oh, I should be thinking about mental trauma that they encounter. Like students, I work out of Marquette. In the past 2 or 3 years, they've covered 2 or 3 student deaths. Like that's a trauma, and some of these students come back and are like, I didn't know how to cover this. I didn't know what I could ask. What do I do now? And so we have a big responsibility and a big opportunity to prepare this next wave of journalists for what they can anticipate and what they can expect in this industry. So the risks are real. I mean, any working journalist can tell you that. You can cover a sporting event, a Boston Marathon. You can cover a concert like in Las Vegas. The risks are around us, and I believe we have a duty and a responsibility for this next generation to make sure we're making them aware of it, not to scare them, but to empower them in terms of thinking about their own safety and the safety of those they work with.
And Kate, you've lived some of this. So you were one of the journalists covering January 6th. Can you talk a little bit about what that moment was like and how it affected you, both as a reporter and as a citizen?
Yeah. First, I want to acknowledge the humans in the room. Hi, thanks for being here. And also, I just want to check in, kind of a general poll. Has anybody in this room felt an elevated level of stress lately? And if you have, just put your hand over your heart. Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge that. And what I've been realizing is that we're a very cerebral group. Journalists are thinkers, writers, right? And have historically been really disconnected from my body. And in elevated levels of stress like this, we go. It's grit, you compartmentalize. And part of the process, I'll get to January 6th, but part of the process part of the antidote to this period of fight, flight, freeze that we're chronically in is beginning to notice, am I in an elevated level of stress? And just, a basic thing is put your hand over your heart. So on January 6th, when I woke up that morning, I was already burnt out. I had been covering the pandemic. We hadn't had vaccines yet, so I was with the visual enterprise team with Washington Post Opinions, and we were a very small team that had our staff cut, our resources cut, and so I turned from a manager to a player coach, where I was both, running coverage, but then also doing the coverage. So we were under-resourced, overstressed. It was the pandemic. We covered the racial justice protests after George Floyd, and then we covered the presidential election. And so when January 6th happened, I wanted to be in my pajamas, and I probably should have, as many of the journalists, would have liked. But we had a duty to bear witness to history, and so I pulled on a bulletproof vest. I had a helmet that the Washington Post gave me, and I went out with my colleague who is a videographer to bear witness to the rally that then, of course, turned into a riot and what I refer to as an insurrection in an attempt to undermine the peaceful transfer of power. I am very good at handling stressful situations because over a career of being in hostile environments and also growing up in a very unpredictable, hostile home, I have learned to navigate unpredictability. And these are superpowers, right? These are what enables you to endure very high levels of stress and execute clearly, calmly, and deliver the package. And so that's what I did. We were surrounded and threatened by members of the mob. Ashley Babbitt, a Trump supporter, had been shot and killed inside the Capitol, and word of her death had spread. And when I was on the back side of the Capitol wearing my bulletproof vest with a notebook and a camera, I clearly was press. And a man said, "Who do you work for?" And because journalists typically identify themselves, and this was a lesson that I would learn there, I said I work for the Washington Post. And when he heard that I worked for the Washington Post, he flew at me. "The Washington Post, you should be ashamed of yourself." And he said that a lady died because of my lies. So he was looking for somebody to blame for the death of Ashley Babbitt. And if you had been covering, which I had been covering this movement, some people were intoxicated by misinformation and manipulation. Some people really wanted an overthrow of the government, right? You know that militias and anti-government groups have been waiting for the first shot to be fired. And so my concern was that that would be perceived as the first shot, and that would give rationalization of an attack back on us. So I treated this situation with tremendous calm and tremendous calm. Like, let's be serious. I was shitting my pants. But, I knew that if I were to, yell back, run, it would provoke them more. So I stayed calm and I practiced compassionate curiosity. And I asked them, "Help me understand why you're here." And I nodded a lot, and because one guy came, and then it was like flies to honey, just surrounding and screaming at us. And so I nodded and looked people in the eye, and I said, "What frustrates you the most?" and people began to actually like tease out their frustrations. And so I for sure was dissociated for part of it because this went on for a long time, but I can only remember parts of it. But there was one moment where somebody said, "You should be with us. You're a middle-aged white lady. You should be with us, not Antifa." And I turned to him and I said, "What about me says middle-aged?" And he got embarrassed and the crowd laughed. And that moment of humanity made them realize, oh, this is a person. And it broke the trance just enough for us to move out. I stuck the landing. I've generally been behind the scenes, and I stuck the landing and was on Morning Joe, and like, this is what we're supposed to do. But what it revealed was I had complex PTSD. New trauma wakes up old trauma, right? If you have a broken leg, it can heal, but then if you go running and it breaks again, it's going to be harder to run on. And so I had many layers over a career and a lifetime that became awakened. I recognized that my newsroom spoke the vocabulary of trauma, but wasn't fluent in the language. That they would bring in trauma workshops after the fact, but have no idea that they were burning us out and pushing us to the point where we could have a breakdown if one more thing hit our window of tolerance. We spend more time prepping our gear than we do having a self-assessment of, have I been sleeping? Am I eating? Have I experienced death? Am I shut down? Am I so shut down that I'm not even yawning? We don't know the signals of our nervous system about when we're dysregulated because we're so cerebral. And so as I began to do my own healing and learn all of this, I recognized that I was stuck in a depleted, dysfunctional system, and that if I continued in the way that I would be replicating the harm that I objected to. So I left.
So what should psychological safety then look like in a newsroom, right? We talk a lot about physical risk and physical assessments before people go out, but are we training editors to recognize burnout, to recognize trauma or signs that someone is not okay, and what more can and should be done?
I mean, I just talked a lot. I'm happy to, so let me keep talking.
All good. Don't worry.
I think we need to understand that our nervous system is our first storyteller. And that is beginning to be aware of our states of stress and relaxation, and that seems really simple. But if you don't even know what relaxation feels like because you're so elevated all the time, you're either rattling with adrenaline, which is addictive. Like, I don't like to be at rest. I'm a workaholic. It is a coping mechanism. I prefer working than drinking or something else. But anyway, we need literal lessons on understanding our states of stress and relaxation so that we can know when we're in an elevated state. We need to better understand the science of trauma and how it affects our brain. We need to understand the science of trauma and how it affects our body and our relationships. And then, we need to have regular check-ins, psychological safety check-ins that doesn't stigmatize. It's just like, have you slept? Have you, and then we need to look at the system. Here's the thing. In this country, we individualize problems. We have a multi-billion-dollar wellness industry that tells you if you do this diet or do this exercise or do this Calm app, it'll be better. But we have to look at it from an individual, collective, and systemic level, like even in the newsrooms, and to notice where are the pressure points. Pressure points include unclear communication. I was straddling the opinions section and the news section. I was depleted with my job. The resources were cut. There wasn't clear communication. So it's like, helping people understand their states of stress and relaxation, normalizing and teaching somatic grounding exercises to be able to help regulate your stress so you don't go beyond your window of tolerance, and then looking outward. This is a moment where we're just going to keep, if journalism is part of the solution of this crisis, it's also a contributor to the problem. And if we don't support journalists, if we don't begin to understand how our burnout affects the wider picture and how the wider picture affects our burnout, this is just, we're gonna just keep repeating the cycles.
If I can add one thing.
Yeah.
So I was recently talking to a journalist who was nearing the end of her career, and she was pointing out that in her training, she'd always heard, like, what you need to watch out for is when you become desensitized. But she said that's not what she's experienced. She's not able to let things go. So it was almost overly sensitive to this, and like the story stayed with her, and she couldn't let them go. And she hadn't been prepped for that. She'd been prepped for when I become numb to it, not when it's overwhelming.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it ties directly in what you're saying about like recognizing this, like, and how do you deal with it? How do newsrooms deal with that?
And the other thing is, like, we're always preparing for catastrophe, but guess what? 2 out of 3 Americans had an adverse childhood experience when they were growing up. So the experiences of what you grew up with inform who you are today. And that is an absolute strength because it can make you more sensitive to stories. It can make you more curious about what are the underlying roots of these things. It's a superpower. And also, maybe an adverse childhood experience, also known as trauma or adversity when you're young, wakes up when you're older, totally unexpectedly, and you haven't witnessed a car crash, but you've vicariously watched a video that woke something up. We don't understand this. Like, we need to better understand the threads of past, present, and what we're putting into the future, you know?
So Anna, let me ask you about something we talk about often in our own newsroom, which is the other sort of prong of psychological safety, and that's online harassment to journalists. How are you thinking about protecting reporters on your team, particularly political reporters in Washington, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, when the temperature is so high and doesn't seem to be going down anytime soon?
As Mike knows, we talk about this a lot. So, this is really, this is like a continuous situation. And I think about this and talk about this. I've talked about it like 4 times already today. And just an ongoing concern and real problem. But it's multitude. I sometimes think when we think of like online harassment, we think of that as like on social media, journalists getting, lots of trolls and others saying bad things about them, threatening them, posting terrible things about them. And that is true. That happens. And it is awful. And it is comes sometimes when you might be prepared for it because you just are about to do a story or you're very visible in your job. It also sometimes comes out of nowhere. It's in response to something that you weren't, necessarily thinking that was going to be the story or that was going to be the moment that all of a sudden got all this attention. It also, though, comes in the form of things that, you can turn off social media. There's things that we do at the AP and lots of news organizations do to help monitor that so that you don't have to as the journalist yourself. We have support systems around that. But it comes in your inbox. It comes sometimes as text message. It just comes in ways that you actually can't always, shut it out and turn it off and, say, I'm not going to be on X platform anymore because you still need to use your email for your job. And I also think it's one of the things I'm, increasingly concerned about and how we prepare for this and how we respond to this is both the sort of online harassment and abuse that happens, but also it is in person. Mm-hmm. It is the turning the cameras on the journalist to kind of create a viral moment. This happens certainly, around, campaigning, but lots of other things. It happens all over the country and all over the world, honestly. And so it's not something that just pertains to things in Washington and the coverage here. And that part, and it increasingly is happening in all different kinds of forums where the goal is sort of to, make the journalists, turn on the journalists, have, people shout at them, have some sort of moment, and that's in person, right? That's not happening online, and then it transfers into the online. One of the things that, there are tools and things that we can do to monitor, make sure, threats. We can use different programs so that our, so that journalist information isn't out there and easy to be found, which is important. But I also, I think a lot about what we can do to better prepare ourselves, that we sort of don't feel helpless in those situations. Because a lot of it is stuff that you didn't have control. It's a story you wrote, it's something you did. But to feel like you have agency to do something, both from the support of the news organization to provide that agency, but also from within yourself to do that, because there are things that we can do. We can prepare ourselves to some extent for that. We can be ready for it. We know that this is going to happen. We know that it's going to happen more and more. And how we can, make it so that it doesn't feel that. I think one of the hardest parts about those situations is that feeling of helplessness and feeling that you have no control anymore over what is happening to you. And I think all the tools and ways that we can do that, at the AP, and I know other news organizations this too. It's not just something that gets put into this one bucket. It's just something you talk about with their safety team. It's really, increasingly you need a more full throng, and it involves legal, it involves corporate communications, it involves obviously your editorial managers, it's really like a collective effort around these things to have that response, to both respond, in the best way possible to mitigate risk in advance, and to do risk assessments and mitigate that risk. And then if something indeed happens, the harassment, the abuse, that you are prepared to react to that, but also from a real collective effort. And I hope, get to a place where we can increasingly feel like we have at least some agency over it, and it doesn't make us feel so helpless when that happens. But it is an intimidation. And I think when it comes to the press freedoms, what we're talking about, a lot of this is intimidation, and it's to, intimidate journalists from doing their jobs, and from, being concerned about the repercussions because you reported something that the world should know about, that people should know about, that's accurate and fact-based, and but the potential for repercussions that you get, tons of like really awful things sent to you in your email or on social media, and that sometimes translates then into physical as well. So I think, better ways that we can prepare ourselves so that we feel like we have some agency over that, so that it doesn't allow that intimidation to keep journalists from doing the jobs that they need to do.
Let me jump off there. So, Tom, you work a lot with early career and college journalists. So, do you think that we're honest enough with early career journalists about the risk of this work today? Not just the physical danger we're talking about, but this psychological wear, the online abuse, legal pressure. What ultimately is the responsibility there?
Right. So the short answer is no. One of the things that we start with, and as you just mentioned, is risk assessments. Like having students at a very young age, no matter what they're covering, think about a risk assessment. Like, where am I going? When am I supposed to be back? Who knows when I'm supposed to be back? Recently, at my alma mater, when the RNC was in Milwaukee, they sent a 19-year-old female journalism student to the RNC by herself. And we got wind of that, and we're like, what was the thinking behind this? Like, she expressed concern. Her student editor said, well, the other person can't make it. But then there also was a sign-off by a faculty advisor, and we were like, what are we, how are we training our journalists? Is this the right environment? Should this student be alone, going to the checkpoint, then going into the Pfizer forum where it was held, which once you're inside, that's great, but there's a lot to navigate. And we need to make sure that they're following a similar protocol that a bureau would do, that an organization would do, in terms of how are we preparing them to cover stories that could include risk and do include risk. And again, domestically, almost everything you cover these days can include risk, whether it's going to be how people respond online, how people treat press, where people are very dug in terms of their view of the press. And again, saying I'm a student offers zero protection. No, okay, you're a student, we'll leave you alone. That's not how it works. So I think we have to do a better job of having young journalists build habits that when they are working as students, and journalism is one of the few majors where you are actually working at your job throughout your college career. You are doing the work that you will do later. So if you're not building good habits that are going to keep you safe, why would that all of a sudden like click when, oh, I got my degree now I'm safe because I've graduated? Like, we have to be very intentional in terms of explaining and sharing and training young journalists like this is what's involved with the trade that or the craft that you are looking to go into. So I think there's more we can do, and again, we have a responsibility. If we want young journalists to get into the field and then stay in the industry, they have to know that this is how the industry is working right now. So there's a lot we can do.
Let me jump to a little bit topic-wise here, and Anna, maybe we can talk a little bit about this, and then I want to get Paul's perspective too. But we've seen some rollbacks and revisions to the Justice Department's media policy in the last week that could make it easier to subpoena journalists or even potentially raid American newsrooms. Can you talk about the broader implication of those policy shifts and how news organizations or the AP, for example, might be preparing on that front, and concerns that you might have about the changes in some of those policies?
Yeah, the news late last week was obviously deeply concerning, and I think the AP, unfortunately, this has happened to the Associated Press in the past. I think 2013 under the Obama administration, during a leaks investigation, they widely tapped phones and a whole lot of things that happened at the AP that is exactly the opposite of what journalists need to be able to do their job, and without government interference in doing that job. And so, I think that this, we're still, I think, trying to figure out exactly what the implications are and what this, what the specifics will be from Attorney General Pam Bondi's memo on Friday, I believe it was Thursday or Friday. But it is concerning. And I think, it is concerning that journalists, when you don't have those protections, to not, have to be subpoenaed, to not have, search warrants happen with the reporting that journalists are doing in the course of their work. And so, I think that lots of news organizations probably already have been and are continuing to have those kind of conversations of what they can do to protect their journalists, to protect their sources. But it is I think that it is deeply concerning.
And so, Paul, let me ask, if the next sort of big press freedom crisis comes, whether that is a Justice Department subpoena or an investigation or a, chilling civil suit like we saw with Mississippi Today, and it's not targeting a major outlet, right? It could hit someone who's working alone, without a legal team, without those deep pockets. Do you think the broad press freedom community and journalists in America are ready for that fight? And then who shows up for those journalists when the stakes are highest?
I don't know a senior editor or publisher of an American news outlet that doesn't think that this isn't going to get a lot worse in the coming months. And maybe Pam Bondi's memo was the start of it, but I think everyone is, to some degree, waiting for, or to a considerable degree, trying to figure out when the storm is coming and what it's going to look like. In that scenario, I think the big media organizations obviously have the resources to plan for it. They have big legal departments, they have sophisticated lawyers. The people I worry about most in that scenario are, and we see more and more of them with the fragmentation of the media, single operators, Substack writers, very influential people who have their platforms today to produce excellent journalism and have none of the backing. A single lawsuit would put them out of business. Right? I mean, that's all it will take. A single lawsuit against Dow Jones and Company isn't going to end Wall Street Journal. A single lawsuit against a solo operator, and they're toast. That, if you decide to go after the media in America, given how fragmented it is, there is a huge number of people that you could take out before you get to the big organizations that you would expect to stand up and defend themselves. Right? So that is a definite concern. at that point, again, I don't know the answer to your question, Mike, because we haven't seen it, but do we collectively have the confidence that the industry would step up and support each other in the event of a crisis? And I suspect a lot of people would stand up for a Mississippi Today, because Mississippi Today isn't a competitor. You're not standing next to them every day in the White House pool, and you're not having to judge how you do your business based on what Mississippi Today does. So I think a lot of people did pile in behind that and help with the lawsuit and stuff like that. That's another case where that's an appealing case if you want to show your bona fides as a press freedom supporter to go after that. We haven't seen it come really to the crunch of how much cost are people willing to bear to support other institutions who are under attack. And that's something that, as everybody plans for what is it going to mean to me when it happens, they should also be planning for what are we going to do for someone else when it happens to them. I can only hope the answer will not be nothing, but in intelligence terminology, I probably have low confidence in that assessment. And I'm not particularly optimistic that the media will find a way to support itself strongly enough that it will actually make much of a difference. But I hope I'm wrong.
Anna, how has the response of the media been to the AP situation, and what would be a more helpful response?
I think, the response is we've gotten a lot of, support. I think, both behind the scenes and some public support for our situation. I think it is complicated, as Paul was detailing, with media organizations, there's different pressures, there's different, their objective, there's just a difference. And I think that this is a really complicated and challenging time across the board, because there's also a lot of pressures hitting all different media in all different ways, from, both from press freedom issues to financial issues to all of these things all at once. And it has made it, it has just made it complicated regardless of our situation, but for everyone.
But isn't it complicated sort of up to a point?
Yeah, exactly.
After which, isn't it pretty clear cut, actually, where you should be on this? I mean, look, National Press Club, Mike, the Press Club does and can and will be in the future, I think, playing an even greater role in this, because I do think it's can be difficult for media organizations to stand up and declare. But I think in that case, the Press Club can play a role in representing that voice of principle in a complicated debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy that we do. Let me ask this final question to all of you, and we can go down the line here. So if you could change one thing about how we defend press freedom in the U.S. right now, one thing the industry needs to do differently, what would it be? And what gives you hope right now? What should we build on?
Everybody's looking at you.
So, one of the things that gives me hope, I'll start with that, is working with students, knowing what we know about the press and loss of newsrooms and stuff, is how inspired they are, how many are still looking to be storytellers, to be fact tellers. Also, what gives me some hope is this generation didn't grow up with two newspapers on the front porch. Like, I'd wake up when I was a kid, and there'd be the Sun Times, the Chicago Tribune, and then a weekly that would come, and I was always reading. So as the industry changes, for the younger journalists, it's not really a change. It's what they know. Like, they've been scrolling, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I don't think that they have to be moved as much as someone like me who still wants a physical copy in my hand and doesn't mind that I'm reading the New Yorker for last week's news. And so I have hope that this younger generation is not being turned off, that they are starting to recognize the risk, but they want to tell stories. They want to be out there gathering information, and they're hungry to do that work. So that does give me hope.
Not sound like a broken record, but I would hope that the industry would find a way to stand up for the principles which it espouses on a daily basis, and when the going gets tough, that they stick up for those principles in the face of adversity, as we have seen can happen when we're challenged in other parts of the world. I hope the response will be similar here.
I think one of the most important things for press freedom is to support the health and safety of journalists, and this is not just in catastrophic crisis, but all the time. So I think resilience training and helping people, prevention is better than cure, essentially. And then what gives me hope is that we now talk about these things, right? We have 50 years of research in science where people now understand that PTSD is a thing. People use the word trauma and aren't always triggered. So we have 50 years behind us, and we're at a point where we can apply this science and understanding to perpetuate cycles of well-being. So we're at a pivot point here, and that gives me hope.
These are all been great answers, and I'm a naturally optimistic person, but one of the hope that gives me is that there's really good journalism happening every single day. There's really good journalism happening by all different sorts of outlets, from the biggest outlets to smaller outlets, both in the United States and around the world. And I think that to me gives me a lot of hope that there is not really good journalism is happening all of the time, all different types of things and all really important subjects about so many things. And so that gives me a lot of hope. And then I do think, from my perspective, it's a small hope, but through all these challenges that the AP has had this in the past couple of months, we do get also, feedback from readers and from our customers, and a lot of it really, and for all the, here we were talking about like a lot of like the negative and harassment and horrible things that we're told, but there is also when someone, particularly someone somewhere in in the U.S. has, I've gotten personal messages from people I don't know who've just reached out to say that story was really good. I really appreciate the journalism that the AP does every day, and to me that gives me a lot of hope too, because lots of people still really want quality, fact-based, nonpartisan journalism every single day, and that makes me hopeful.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you again to our sponsors, including the Foley Foundation, and most of all, thank you to our panelists for such an honest, urgent, and necessary conversation. What we heard today should leave no doubt. Threats to press freedom in this country are real, and they're growing, but so is our resolve. At the Press Freedom Center, we believe the way forward is not just to raise the alarm, but to respond with action, with resources, and with solidarity, and that's what this moment calls for. I hope you'll all join us for additional programs we have lined up today and tomorrow. Each one is designed to meet this moment with the seriousness and creativity it demands. And if you believe in this work, if you want to help us support journalists in crisis and protect the right to report freely and safely, I hope you'll consider making a donation to the Press Freedom Center here at the National Press Club. Every contribution helps us respond faster, reach farther, and stand stronger in defense of independent journalism. Because protecting the press isn't just about protecting a profession, it's about defending the public's right to know and the strength of our democracy itself. Thank you again for being with us.